Hi, I'm Julissa Ponce, and I'm the moderator today. Thank you for joining us on today's peer support call on the eviction moratorium. Um, this webinar is being brought to you by the Freedom Network's Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project, funded by the Office of Victims of Crime. We provide support and resources to service providers such as yourselves on understanding and connecting the housing options to survivors of trafficking. Today's panelists are Renee and Carlo. And since we're in a bit of a time crunch and we have a lot to go over, we can provide their bios if they're requested. But before we start, I just wanted to remind everyone that we will have a Q&A section at the end. Feel free to use the chat for questions. This is available also in closed captioning, and the webinar will be recorded. Thank you. If you, Carrie, want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, fantastic. Just as Julissa said, our colleagues Carlo and Renee will be joining us to go over content. And thank you for being here and talking about the eviction moratorium and how we can prepare direct source providers and communities to prepare for this. So Alana, if you want to go to next slide, please. So for today's discussion, we're really going to talk about the eviction protections related to COVID-19, talking about a status update on the CDC eviction moratorium, as well as some really practical steps in preparing for the ending of this moratorium and different options for rental assistance and repayment plans. Again, towards the end of this, really our remaining 30 minutes of this hour together, we really want to focus on questions that you all have, really open discussion and conversation where we can call on Renee and Carlo's experience and expertise to kind of talk through the situations that you are all experiencing. So if you want to go ahead and go to next slide, that would be great. So really want to start with some practical application. So talking really about as the eviction moratorium has been extended over this last year and really kind of impacting maybe our preparedness in the continued extension of this moratorium. And with that being said, as Renee and Carlo have been in spaces, really this will be the last federal extension. So coming at the end of July here. So really talking about that, this is kind of that final last 30 days to really kind of get prepared as programs, as a community, and really serving survivors and preparing for this. So a couple of practical things we want to talk about is really looking within your communities, your state, what state and local protections maybe have been in place to protect survivors and or renters through COVID and different evictions throughout the eviction moratorium. So really connecting state and locally and focusing on that individualized protection and support. With that, again, talking about intentional outreach to those different housing providers, knowing the different rental resources that are available in your community, as well as if you're connected already with different landlords and property management companies, to kind of, again, make sure that they're aware that there is rental assistance available, as well as the different protections that people have, that they may know some more individual experiences of their renters that they could then be connecting them with you all as providers and as community members. Again, when thinking about the funding that maybe your organization or community has available for different rental assistance programs, really working on getting survivors connected to those programs, to those direct service providers, those points of contact early. So then that way, working on documentation, which we'll talk about further throughout our conversation today, to make sure all those logistical things can be in place and survivors have what they need to protect themselves from those evictions. Also then looking at your individual funding, right, that you have at your organization and or in your community. If you have OVC assistance funding, as well as housing projects, local funding that supports housing needs, and or different HUD funding, looking at your budgets, those dollars that you have available, and talking with your OVC grant manager, talking with your points of contact locally that you have that support your organization with funding, and talking about any budget kind of revisions, things that you can do to shift around funding to prepare for some of the ending of the eviction moratorium. Also really want to center having conversations with survivors that you're supporting, right? What are ways in which that we can prepare survivors? What are wraparound resources and support that we can make sure that they're connected with to meet those needs, as well as to be prepared for that ending of the eviction moratorium? We can go ahead and go to next slide, please. So really want to talk about here in these next few slides some of the disproportionately effects that COVID-19 is having on BIPOC communities. And in this first slide here, we're talking about how due to the structural inequalities, right, that in the United States for Black, Latinx, and Native Americans, they have experienced worse outcomes at higher rates from COVID, including hospitalization and death. So if you're looking at this chart here, it talks about, right, that, for example, in the first line here, that the different cases for American Indian and or Alaskan Native non-Hispanic persons, they're experiencing 1.6 times more cases of COVID-19 in comparison to their white counterparts. So again, as you see these stats here, recognizing that the CDC says that in this chart, right, race and ethnicity are matters for other underlying conditions that affect health, including socioeconomic status, access to healthcare, and other exposure to the virus related to occupation. So again, really understanding that as the eviction moratorium is coming to an end, how BIPOC communities have been impacted by COVID-19. So go ahead and go to next slide, please. So when we look here, right, evictions being more common among unvaccinated people, and really talking about just previously in the slide how BIPOC communities are impacted, this pandemic has impacted different populations differently, right? Communities who are less likely to be vaccinated are more likely to also be evicted. So in looking at this and talking about this conversation, it underscores the importance of avoiding eviction, right? Preparing for this eviction moratorium and understanding that as a result, people who might be unvaccinated will need increased access to congregate living settings and how this could impact our communities, and then the further spread of COVID and more vulnerable populations being impacted. So this discrepancy comes, as it increases some of that danger of the spread of COVID and just more populations being impacted by that. Go ahead and go to next slide, please. So again, talking about housing insecurity, according to the Center for Economic Policy and Research, who has provided this graphic, and as you see here, we kind of hyperlinked out renters specifically to Black and Hispanic populations. Hispanic and Black renters have particularly large increases in housing insecurity, with roughly 44% of renters in both groups reporting housing insecurity during this pandemic. So what that means is that there's been an increase of 11% for Hispanic renters and 7% for Black renters since 2019 reporting housing insecurity. So again, this talking about housing insecurity, and then talking about increased eviction rates, and then the spread of COVID, and thinking about the compounding impacts for our BIPOC communities. And also with this research, it talks about how housing insecurity was most common in the South, particularly Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. Go ahead and go to next slide, please. So again, talking about evictions and what that kind of looks like. So again, researchers have found by looking at this graph here that filing and eviction rates were on average significantly higher for Black renters than white renters. And so the share of eviction filings and eviction judgments against Black renters were also considerably higher, higher than the share of other like rental populations. So again, talking about how Black individuals were only 19.9% of all the adults who had filled out this renter information in this survey, but 32.7% of them were sued for eviction. So again, looking at the differences in Black renters and then those being sued for eviction. And also in this, not shown in this graph, there's some of the same research talking about how women's, especially Black and Latinx women, were also evicted at higher rates than men. So taking that all together, right, this means that the eviction is a racial and gender justice issue, and how, as again, community members and providers were working to prepare for the end of the eviction moratorium, and how all those are impacting one another. So we can go ahead and go to next slide, and I will hand it over to Renee to review this.
Thanks, Carrie. I'm actually going to jump in right here. I'll do the next few slides. So we're going to talk a little bit about the CDC eviction moratorium. I'm sure many of you on the call today have heard about it. The federal eviction moratorium has been extended for one last time. So the moratorium will now expire on July 31st. What does the moratorium do? It prevents evictions of tenants who cannot pay rent for a certain period of time. So from September 4th, 2020 through July 31st, 2021, which is the new deadline. The moratorium prevents landlords from physically removing tenants from their homes. So it actually prevents tenants from being physically removed. But what it does not do is it does not stop landlords from filing evictions in state or local courts. So those kinds of legal proceedings can continue, but tenants themselves cannot be physically removed from their homes during this time period. Keep in mind also that not everyone qualifies for the CDC eviction protection. There are income and other requirements, so please go ahead and take a look at the declaration form, which is linked there. It has a series of questions and check boxes to help folks determine if they qualify for the protection. Each adult on the lease or rental agreement should complete the declaration and submit it to their landlord. And the form is available in 12 other languages, which is also available on the CDC's website. There are some states and localities that still have their own eviction and utilities moratoria that are in effect. And so if you're curious about those, you can go ahead and go to the Eviction Lab website, which I can put in the chat box right now. And that'll give you a list of list of states and localities that still have some local protections in place. It looks like most of them are going to go through this month and maybe expire at the beginning of August, but there are a few that are going to go past the August deadline. So go ahead and take a look at that. Really important to remember also is that the moratorium protections do not cancel rent. So rent is still accruing, and after July 31st, there are going to be a lot of tenants who are going to owe huge sums of rent. So for tenants who can still pay rent, even if it's just a portion of the rent, we're really advising folks to continue to do that right now, to pay rent to the landlords. If you're working with a survivor whose rent is income-based, meaning that the amount of rent and housing assistance they get is dependent on their income, then we're encouraging folks to make sure that if their income has decreased, that they are getting their income recertified. So making sure that that information is up to date so that they can get more housing assistance if the household's income has decreased, and then therefore the amount of rent that they owe will decrease as well. So Renee is going to talk about some strategies to help tenants, like negotiating payments and getting folks access to federal rental assistance dollars. Like I mentioned before, this extension of the CDC eviction moratorium will be the last one. So helping tenants access the $46 billion in COVID-19 assistance is going to be really important from the federal government. And again, Renee is going to walk us through that. Oh, sorry, can you go back to the slide before? There are a couple of eviction protections for survivors that are still in place. I'll go first to the CARES Act. The CARES Act protection actually applies to everybody. So under the CARES Act, anyone who lives in a unit that is federally subsidized, meaning there's some kind of housing assistance that's coming from the federal government, they all have the right to receive an eviction notice that provides for at least 30 days notice to vacate. So that includes public housing, folks getting housing choice vouchers, project-based Section 8, people who are living in multifamily housing that's being paid for by the Rural Development Office, and low-income housing tax credit units. Those are a couple of examples of federally assisted housing, but there is a right to a 30-day notice in those units. And then for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, there are Violence Against Women Act housing protections that are in place that protect survivors from being evicted or having their assistance terminated because of the violence they experience. Along the same lines, there are fair housing laws, as well as other state and local laws that are in place to help survivors stay in their homes as well. So if you want more information, you can go to NHLP's website to take a look at that. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you're working with a client that receives an eviction notice, we're really encouraging that everyone who gets an eviction notice to go ahead and consult a housing attorney immediately to talk about their rights and their options. Even though there is a moratorium in effect, and even if the client qualifies for this moratorium, it's really important that that survivors and clients get some kind of legal representation. Just because a moratorium is in place, it does not mean that you ignore an eviction notice. It's really important that clients' housing rights are preserved. And know that housing providers might still try and go ahead and file an eviction, even though there is a moratorium in effect, and even if the tenant has asserted their right to this eviction protection. What we're seeing is that there are housing providers that are still moving forward with evictions. Next slide. If you're working with folks who are asserting their rights under any eviction moratorium, please tell them to keep copies of the correspondence to the landlord. Again, what we're seeing is that landlords are denying that they received any kind of notification, the declaration form, or anything related to the moratorium, and they're moving forward with eviction. So the more paper trail or documentation that folks have to really show to a judge or in a court that, hey, I actually asserted this protection, so I should not be evicted, the better. We're also telling folks to submit, if they can, the declaration they send to their landlord by certified mail or via email so that there is a record in place. And then for folks, I already made the last point about making sure that for folks who are living in assisted housing, that their income is up to date and being recertified so that their assistance can increase if the household has experienced some kind of decrease in their income. So one last point is about confidentiality. Because we are working with survivors and so much of their information is really important to keep confidential and private, to remind landlords that it's critical to keep this information of survivors confidential, whether that's communications or things being sent back and forth in the mail or via email, making sure that those accounts and mailboxes are private and secure. And I'll go ahead and turn it to Renee.
Thanks, Carlo, and thanks, Carrie, and Lisa as well. Thanks so much for coming today and learning more about, as we are transitioning into, sort of thinking about what's going to happen after the moratorium. This convening is actually really well timed with the extension. And so what we want to do is make sure that folks are equipped to work with their clients to kind of make it through, these last few weeks of the moratorium, and then, sort of transition into thinking after the moratorium. In a lot of ways, at least in some jurisdictions, there are courts who, don't consider the CDC moratorium, as binding anymore. There's been a lot of back and forth in the courts. And so all of this is very timely information. And as Carlos said, and I just want to reiterate, anytime a client receives an eviction notice, if they can be referred to legal aid or housing attorney on staff, that's going to give the client the best chance of being able to preserve all of their rights. Carlo went through a lot of other protections that may be in place. So anyway, just wanted to center that discussion. And if we could move to the next slide. So apologies, I have a very upset puppy outside, outside my office here. So in terms of, Carlo mentioned that there are a lot of folks who during the pandemic, a lot of survivors who have pretty significant rental arrears, right? They owe a lot of rental debt. And so one of the resources that, we're really trying to call folks' attention to, and also really make sure that folks are getting the word out to housing providers, particularly small landlords. We're hearing that the information about the availability of billions of dollars of rental assistance is, not necessarily reaching folks, right? And so that might be sort of educating housing providers about the availability of rental assistance might actually be an important step in terms of helping your client avoid eviction. So as I mentioned, throughout the pandemic, there have been billions of dollars from the federal government that have been allocated for rental assistance. I'm going to focus on what I've put on the slide as collectively the ERAP program, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. There's sort of two waves or tranches, if you will, of the more recent rental assistance for ERAP. And so those are the ones that we're going to focus on. I know that there was a question, I believe, from someone who registered, talking about other sources of rental assistance, you know, the first stop, you know, should be your local government. And as you see on the slide, there are a few places where you can go to check to see if your locality has a rental assistance program in place. And so the National Low Income Housing Coalition is a really good one. It's updated pretty regularly, as well as the NCSHA. It's another sort of housing industry group, is also tracking rental assistance. So I think as a first step, I would check those, find your community, and see if your locality is accepting applications, what the status is of the rental assistance program, where you live. So I think that's the first step. One thing to note, because you know the money is flowing in tranches, and you know, just because someone might come upon a local rental assistance program and see, oh, they're not taking applications, or they say they're out of money, keep checking, because as these funds are becoming available, just because a rental assistance program might not be taking applications now, they might be taking applications in the near future. So check early and often with respect to the rental assistance. I think that is going to be the most likely source of rental assistance for folks. Other places where you can look might be, for example, private foundations locally may also be doing rental assistance programs. But I think, you know, the state and local programs are really where a lot of the money from the federal government is being funneled and directed. In addition to emergency rental assistance, one other, particularly since we're talking about the housing needs specifically of trafficking survivors. Somebody dropped in the chat earlier, just to don't also forget about HUD's emergency housing vouchers. We had a previous conversation about emergency housing vouchers with Freedom Network. And so, you know, just remember that that's also in the mix, and you want to try and run down all of these different sources of potential funding for folks who, you know, need housing, right, or housing insecure. Next slide, please. So the way, and I'm going to focus here on ERAP, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. So you also hear, you know, the American Rescue Plan, or this year's budget. Like, these are what kind of make up the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. It's run out of the Treasury Department, and what Treasury is doing is then distributing these funds to state and local governments, as well as tribal governments, and then they can also subgrant to other agencies for distribution. So again, that's why it's really important on the previous slide to look locally to see where the emergency rental assistance is ending up and how it's being distributed in your community. For eligibility, so I'm kind of going to talk about this generally. I mentioned, you know, there's sort of two tranches of emergency rental assistance. They have slightly differing eligibility requirements, but the Treasury Department is setting guidance that they're really encouraging state and local programs to sort of try to make the distribution consistent across the two tranches as much as possible. So one thing to know, right, someone has to basically have some sort of obligation to pay rent, is one of the factors. And then, you know, the second tranche is actually a little bit broader in terms of the nexus between somebody's financial hardship and COVID. So the first tranche, you know, requires a little bit more, it requires a more direct causal relationship between the between COVID and the financial hardship. The second tranche is a little bit more open and permissive. The financial hardship only has to occur during the pandemic, which obviously has sort of a lower threshold for demonstrating the hardship, right? You don't have to go back and show how it's specifically COVID related. And COVID related is also just related to the pandemic, right? So job loss that's related to the pandemic. In terms of, the third requirement is that demonstrating risk of homelessness or housing insecurity. So, getting an eviction notice is the type of thing that, would indicate that somebody is housing insecure and at pretty serious risk of homelessness. And then, there's some slightly differing income requirements, but it's basically, these funds are really targeted at people who are low income, right? And, who meet, fall below a certain threshold of income. Really important is that there are no immigration restrictions. So, localities should not be imposing immigration requirements. We have seen that states have been trying to do things like, require social security numbers, things that, for practical purposes become a de facto immigration requirement. If that's the case, I think that's going to take some, technical assistance and some, just working with the jurisdiction to make them understand that those requirements are not, there are no such restrictions tied to these funds. Really important, the rental assistance doesn't, the tenant is not required to pay the money back, in terms of after they receive rental assistance. And then between these two tranches, tenants can receive up to a total of 18 months of rental assistance. And so what types of things do the rental assistance cover? So it's going to be your current rent, back rent, as well as prospective rent. So rent that, is anticipated to be owed, utility bills and arrears, relocation expenses, which can be important for survivors who need to move, security deposits, again, important for survivors who need to move, rental fees, etc. So there is a lot of flexibility in terms of what these funds are able to provide for. Next slide, please. So, and we want to make sure that we leave enough time for your questions. So I'm just going to take a couple minutes, the last remaining couple minutes, to talk about rental repayment options. So you have, kind of your first line of defense is thinking about getting your client rental assistance to deal with back rent or the inability to pay rent. In terms of clients who can, afford, but for, whatever COVID related income loss, can otherwise afford to remain in their housing, a rental repayment plan is something to consider. So, and this also might have to be an option for folks who, for whatever reason, don't qualify for rental assistance. So again, it's not a one size fits all solution for everybody. And, to the extent possible, if a housing provider is saying enter into a repayment plan, if it's at all possible to work with a housing attorney, or if you have a housing attorney on staff, to make a practice of reviewing those agreements, because there can come some risks. There may be some terms that may negate or otherwise just set up the tenant to actually stay in a tenancy that they can't actually afford. And so, these are just some considerations, because generally the tenant going forward would have to pay their current rent plus some sort of installment on the back rent. And that may be unsustainable for some folks in the long run. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so just here, you know, for folks who are considering repayment plans, and these are not required terms, these are just some things to really think about in terms of provisions that, you know, we think are really helpful and tenant friendly, you know, and it would be great if they could be included in these sorts of repayment agreements. The big one being that, you know, a couple of big ones, like requiring the housing provider to cooperate with the tenant's application for relief funds. So the rental assistance that we've been talking about, not de facto saying that if somebody defaults on the repayment plan is not automatic grounds for eviction. You definitely don't want things like interest and fees on back rent. If at all possible, you want to try and avoid that. You also, you know, one other just term to watch for, and this is really going to be, you know, again, working with local advocates, working with legal aid to really be on the lookout for these types of terms. The other one that is very problematic would be something where the payments on the repayment plan apply to the back rent, the old rent, right, before new rent. Because then, you know, if somebody is short a particular month, they're just kind of going back into the cycle of being in rental arrears. If you have questions about any of this particular, you know, figuring out what sorts of things should go into a repayment plan or not, that's something that NHLP can provide technical assistance on. It's hard to speak in generalities just because, you know, everything is so local and state specific, but please reach out to us. Next slide, please. So just finally, just some scenarios that may arise. So I'm gonna just take one just quick minute, and then we can, you know, also talk about these more during the discussion and Q&A. One thing that keeps coming up is, you know, we are seeing housing providers who don't want to accept rental assistance for one reason or another. Maybe it's the, you know, programmatic requirements, et cetera. So some ways to get, you know, to address that would be, you know, that, you know, with respect to the rental assistance program itself, paying the tenant directly. There's some differences between the two tranches on what is required in terms of getting the housing provider on board. But just again, you know, emphasizing paying the tenant directly to then they can pay that back rent themselves. You know, there may be some arguments related to fair housing about needing a reasonable accommodation if you're working with a client with a disability, of the need for, you know, for the housing provider to accept the payment or need more time to obtain the rental assistance. You know, one argument, if you're working with an attorney, you know, we've also seen housing providers who aren't necessarily wanting to wait for the rental assistance because there have been delays. One argument that an advocate could make with the court is to basically delay the eviction until, you know, the rental assistance is actually available locally. So that could be an approach. You know, again, working, you know, and this might be something to talk to with your local courts about, you know, kind of making these policy arguments that housing providers shouldn't be able to take the rental assistance and then evict for non-payment of rent because that's a lease violation. So, you know, making the argument that that shouldn't be allowed. And then, you know, if a tenant can't get rental assistance, we talked a little bit about repayment plans and bankruptcy, but as a very last resort to wipe out that debt. Next slide, please. And then here's all of our contact information. And now I'm gonna turn it back over to Carrie. and she's going to take us into our second half of today's presentation.
Perfect. Thank you again, Renee and Carlo, for being here to share your just experience and expertise on the eviction moratorium ending and all the work that you have both done thus far. So thank you. So we've had one question come through the chat, as well as my colleague Julissa will be able to reference some questions that we had come in for registration for our information call today. So first, I will direct to the question in the chat. So thank you. As people have other questions that you think of, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A function here in Zoom. So if Carlo and or Renee, the question is related to, can we talk more about the COVID-related hardship? Many of the clients have been struggling for years pre-COVID, and just this has just kind of exacerbated that struggle. Would they be still eligible for funds? Would they have to show other things, documentation on how things have gotten worse due to COVID? Can you kind of walk through that with us? Either one of you. Renee, do you want to start with that? And then Carlo, if you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I can start. So I think, if you look at, and Treasury has put out an FAQ, which I will drop in the chat. A couple of things, so one is that the rental assistance can't be used for rental arrears. So to pay back rental arrears that came into being before, I believe it's March 30th, 2020, which is when the disaster, the emergency declaration was declared. But I think in terms of, the connection with COVID can be fairly attenuated. I mean, it's directly or indirectly related to COVID. So, if there are rental arrears where, somebody's situation got worse during COVID, right? Like they were already, housing insecure, or paying way too much in rent, and then any sort of reduction of income kind of pushed over the edge. I would say that still counts, sort of that loss of income or reduction in income still counts for addressing rental arrears that happened during COVID. So, I think that they're still eligible for rental assistance where the arrears sort of continued during COVID, but maybe not some of the pre-COVID rental arrears. I don't know, Carlo, if you have a separate take on that, but that's sort of my reading, is that anything that sort of happened during COVID, or you can make an argument that COVID made it worse, I think, in terms of rental arrears, I think you can get rental assistance for that piece, but probably not rent that was accrued before COVID. But I don't know, Carlo, if you have a thought on that.
Nope, that's my understanding. Yeah, I agree with you, Renee.
Yeah, and I'll drop the FAQ in the chat. But if you have a particular situation or circumstance that you want to talk more about, like, feel free. But that's my understanding.
Another question we had here in the chat was, you talked a lot about potential evictions based on inability to pay rent. Can tenants still be evicted during this moratorium for issues that are not rent payment related? For example, can someone still be evicted during this moratorium for drug usage on an apartment premises?
Right. So I can take that, and Renee, feel free to add. So that's where there's a distinction, right, between the eviction moratorium protection, which is coming from on the federal level, which really just protects people from evictions if they cannot pay rent. That is really the only basis for protection. However, there are other moratorium state and localities that provide for evictions or prevent evictions for other reasons. So that's why I provided that sort of state and locality protection. It also protects from utility shutoffs too. So definitely take a look at that. And there was also, on that slide that we had about providing other kinds of housing protections for survivors. So I know I see someone here talking about how they, work with survivors. And so those housing protections for survivors where it prevents any kind of adverse housing decision, whether that's an eviction or potential termination of housing assistance, anything that would be bad in a housing context that could happen to a survivor because of the violence they experience. All of those protections are still in place. So for example, if a survivor is using drugs or even distributing drugs, right? We've seen situations like that where they're distributing drugs on the premises, and that is directly related to the domestic violence that they're experiencing against their partners. That would be a basis to protect a survivor under fair housing laws, the Violence Against Women Act, if there are federal assisted units involved. So definitely keep those in mind. There are also a lot of state and local protections. So things like early lease terminations for survivors, lock changes. There are also state and local eviction protections that exist for survivors. So take a look at all of that. It gets a little bit tricky. I know that this audience is primarily an anti-trafficking audience, and some of those state and local protections definitely address trafficking survivors, but the majority will talk about domestic violence and sexual assault. So the trafficking survivors and their experience will have to somehow fall into those categories in the way that they are defined. And again, it's not uniform, right? Like the way that these kinds of violence are defined are not uniform. So you have to really take a close look at the definitions. Yeah.
So one of the next questions from registration was, will there be other forms of funding available to prevent evictions?
Yeah, so I mentioned the emergency housing vouchers, which I believe Kristen dropped in some information in the chat. That's going to be, in Freedom Network hosted a training about a few weeks ago as well, though time is sort of, I can't remember exactly when, but that's another really important resource. That's specifically one of the eligible categories is for survivors of trafficking. So I think that's also something to look into. And that's being coordinated generally through local continuums of care. But as victim service providers, it's really important for folks to be a part of that conversation. And as I mentioned as well, there may be other funds that are privately funded. Philanthropy might also have programs. There might be other government programs as well, but I think that like locally, but I think the rental assistance is really meant to be the primary way to help folks avoid eviction. That's definitely how the administration is talking about the rental assistance. But Carlo, I don't know if you want to, are there other types of funds that are going to come online that you've heard about or that you can think of that can also be used to avoid eviction?
Yeah, I mean, I would really have folks, if someone can actually put the link of state and local emergency rental assistance program links into the chat box, that would be helpful. A lot of those are government funded resources, whether it's federal or state and local governments, but some of them, like Renee said, are coming from private resources. And so the sort of the requirements and restrictions really vary depending on what kind of funding stream you're looking at. Like, so for example, in Los Angeles, there's just tons of homelessness assistance money that really has been leveraged to help people who are suffering during COVID. And a lot of them are private funds. And so it's really going to differ who can access that rental assistance. So I definitely would encourage folks to take a close look at, not just on the state level, but even within the county and municipality level, you see that there are very specific rental assistance funds.
Thank you. The next two questions I think are going to be more for Renee, and they kind of go together. So it goes, what is expected to occur once the moratorium expires? Will individuals be evicted immediately? And then when will landlords be able to file evictions against tenants? Do all states have rental assistance programs due to COVID-19?
Yeah, so those are really good questions. And I think, this really goes back to something that Carlo had mentioned during the webinar that I just want to underscore. So one, in terms of timeline, that's really going to depend on what state you're in. Evictions are very much a state law issue in terms of like how much notice people are entitled to, et cetera. And also, some states have, there are states that have allowed evictions to continue to be filed. And as Carla mentioned, during, the CDC moratorium doesn't stop evictions from being filed. So there may be evictions already pending. It's just what the eviction moratorium really stopped was people being physically removed from their homes. So it's going to really differ state by state in terms of what that timeline looks like. I would also just point out, if you're working with a survivor who is living in federally assisted housing, so, Section 8 public housing, if they're living, in one of those programs, I just want to underscore that there is a 30-day notice requirement under the CARES Act, that has to occur first. So there's a 30-day notice period. So that can also help to give survivors and others more time if they're living in one of those federal housing programs. If they're living on the private market, it really is going to be state specific. But I know, there has been a big push to really try and get states, state courts to, embrace eviction diversion. But, that's going to be up to a lot of, it's going to be up to the states. And so, any sort of eviction notice, should really raise a lot of red flags. And folks should not wait for the end of the moratorium. And, because of a lot of legal challenges, there are some courts that are just, kind of disregarding the moratorium. So to really preserve your client's rights, you really want to try to get them legal representation as quickly as possible upon receiving an eviction notice. And, I think I lost my train of thought, but that's really the big, I think, issue. I would also just, if you have a relationship with your local legal aid office and can speak to, if you're not an attorney yourself or not familiar with housing, to really talk to a local housing attorney to get a sense of what the eviction process is like, how much notice your clients are going to have, how, what does the sort of local picture look like? And National Housing Law Project, we're happy to try and make that connection for folks who may not have an existing relationship with local legal aid. We have contacts in a lot of states, so we're happy to do that. You can definitely just email me. Carlo, do you have anything to add to that? Okay, cool.
So the next question is, my agency is a nonprofit agency and receives HUD and state grants to assist clients with short-term rental assistance. The COVID-19 rental assistance form asks about other assistance that they are receiving, like Section 8, TRA, etc. Is this a yes or no question? How should our clients respond to this question when they are applying for the arrears of the portion of the rent that they owe? And if a survivor is receiving a voucher but broke their lease by having family stay with them temporarily, could they lose their voucher?
So I can, Carlo,
I can take the voucher one if you want.
All right, go ahead.
Oh, okay. We can take the
No,
voucher
I'll do them in the order that we receive them. You're right. I shouldn't put you on the spot. So that's a really, really good question about folks who are living, in some sort of subsidized housing, federally subsidized housing where their rent is based on their income. There's been a lot of, I think, frankly, confusion in terms of rental assistance programs who are saying that if you are in one of those programs that you can't receive rental assistance. That is not true. So I think, it is a yes or no question in the sense of, the client, is either in rental assistance or not. I think the issue really is how is a rental assistance program using that information? Are they using it to screen people out, or are they trying to identify next steps, right? So for folks who are receiving, in subsidized housing, they can get rental assistance for the portion of the rent, as you mentioned, like that they owe, right? Like that their own arrears. But Treasury is also encouraging encouraging rental assistance programs to see if clients, to encourage folks to recertify their income. What Carla was talking about, if they've lost income, and the idea is that the overall amount of rent going forward is going to be reduced. And so all of this is to say it definitely, they definitely can ask that question because, the rental assistance is only folks are only eligible for rental assistance for the portion of the rent, usually 30% of their income that they pay. But if they're using that to screen folks out, then that's problematic. And feel free to reach out to us. But I think it's really more, it's not so much about the question itself, it's about how it's being applied, or if they're trying to encourage folks to recertify, which, if you're working with folks in Section 8 housing and they've lost income during the pandemic, as a lot of people have, they should definitely recertify their income so that their unit is, the rent reflects like their current income situation. I hope that answered your question, Sunita. Feel free to add more in the chat or reach out afterwards. And I will toss it to Carlo to talk about VAWA and vouchers.
Yeah, so this question about the voucher is actually a really good question because it highlights a distinction, right? A voucher is housing assistance. And when you have, say, a housing choice voucher, you are using the voucher assistance in a unit with a private landlord with whom the tenant has a landlord-tenant relationship with and a lease with. And that relationship means there's a tenancy which you could be evicted for. So there's both the housing assistance component and then there's the eviction or potential eviction. There's a tenancy which could lead to a potential eviction. So the eviction moratoriums, generally speaking, the federal eviction moratorium protects folks from an eviction for non-payment of rent. So if a landlord wants to evict you and you're a voucher holder, so actually physically remove you from the unit, that is prevented just because you can't pay rent. That can't be a reason. But what about the voucher assistance, right? This person is asking, well, can they lose the voucher assistance if they broke their lease or violated a lease term because they had family stay with them temporarily? So the eviction moratorium doesn't talk about housing assistance, right? And whether or not essentially your housing assistance can be terminated. And unless you have something state or locally in your moratorium that talks about that explicitly, there's not going to be a protection in place. However, we are clearly working in an administration and in a political climate where across the board, all federal agencies are saying, do not evict people. Do not do anything, housing providers, that would cause families to be out in the streets and be subject more to the pandemic, COVID, and just worsen the public health crisis that we're already in. So housing authorities that are in charge of administering these vouchers are on high alert. They know they need to do whatever it takes to keep people in their homes. So if it means, like, this is happening all over the place, right? Families are relocating, they're doubling up, they're tripling up because they've been evicted in other places. And so we're seeing this across the board. Housing authorities know this. And we know of actually quite a few housing authorities have said, okay, we get it. We get what you're doing. It is technically in violation of the lease term, but we're going to let you stay because you're telling me that this is temporary and this is only going to last a certain period of time. And there are some housing authorities that have even amended some of their policies, at least internally, to kind of accommodate for this. And it might actually, you might actually see it in their Section 8 housing choice voucher policies too. There have been a whole bunch of waivers in terms of what housing authorities can do, where essentially the federal government HUD is saying, do what you got to do to keep people in their homes. And so there's a lot of sort of bureaucratic approvals that have been waived, which has been really, really helpful. So if you're working with a client that is facing this situation, have talked to the housing authority and say, this is the situation. Please do not terminate their assistance for this reason. You know, at some point, these people are going to move out soon. You have our assurances, just keep them in their homes.
The next question is, what is being done to help those who have been affected find jobs?
That's a really good question. I mean, I don't know of anything that's specific in the housing space or that HUD is doing, you know, related to COVID specifically. Carlo, have you heard of anything about sort of job placement or anything like that?
No, I haven't. There's all of the COVID relief, I think right now is focused on essentially helping people who are in immediate crisis and giving people money, basically in response to an economic crisis that we're facing. I think that there has been some efforts to look ahead about how to get people jobs. Some of you might have seen there's now a new focus on making sure that people who have interacted with the criminal justice system, there's a reentry initiative to make sure that folks who are recently or just got out of prison, to make sure they have jobs and that they have housing and resources. So I think the administration is thinking in that direction, right? And starting with a certain subpopulation that is in dire need of these kinds of resources. But I think that is TBD on the federal level.
Yeah.
I'll kind of add a little bit to that too, just from that, you know, housing and supporting survivors to stay in housing has been kind of reviewed in some previous questions. And I would agree kind of in some of that to be determined in, you know, in the future, knowing that retention of housing with access to employment and retention of employment as well. I think right now too, just with the focus of keeping people in housing, you know, with preparedness for the ending of the eviction moratorium, to not put survivors at risk of, you know, re-trafficking or increasing other vulnerabilities and or other things to happen. So that is, again, reiterating, a great question as we continue to keep people in housing with the different rental assistance that's available, as well as just minimizing re-victimization and increased vulnerability for survivors of trafficking who would potentially lose their housing after this eviction moratorium ends. So I think, again, we all know, right, that employment and retention of employment impacts, you know, survivors staying in housing and what that looks like. So I think too, with remaining like 3 minutes, if there's any other final just thoughts and or I think we had one question here come through real quick. Oh yes, thank you for just putting that, right, programs, other people, you know, doing other work specifically with employment and engagement. So I appreciate that, as well as providers oftentimes, you know, interweaving that with housing assistance. So I don't think that there's, I think just again, with being mindful of time, the last 3 minutes, Renee, Carlo, are there any kind of final thoughts just with as programs, as community members are preparing for the eviction moratorium ending? Any other final thoughts that either of you would like to add before we end our call today?
I would just say, you know, for folks who are interacting or have experience with the rental assistance money that's coming down from the federal government, but the way that people are interfacing is really with like the state and local and sometimes community agencies. If you're experiencing any roadblocks that you're hearing about, it would be really helpful to share those stories with the people that we interface with, which are the people at the federal level who are just saying, get the money out as soon as possible, just get it out. And that somehow is not translating based on the data that we're seeing. Like we're seeing people, it's like 25%, 30%, sometimes it's 5% in terms of the applications that are getting and how many are getting approved. And that just seems to me like such a huge disconnect. So if there are stories that people feel like they're comfortable sharing, telling us like we tried to, and this is what they told us, so that we can bring this back and really, you know, just make the case that more needs to be done on the federal level. I know immigration is a huge issue. Like Renee said, lots of folks are asking for social security numbers and all this stuff, but things like that would be really helpful to know.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And, you know, as well, like, you know, we have resources, you know, related to sort of immigration requirements and those types of things. You know, so if you know, you know, there are other folks on staff at NHLP who have worked, you know, to try and kind of reiterate the lack of immigration requirements to local programs. So, you know, if you need that type of assistance, yeah, please reach out. You know, and I would also say too, if any of you on the line have relationships with your local courts or your state courts, you know, and just really making the case for eviction diversion, or at minimum, you know, having requirements in place. The court adopts requirements that landlords should apply for rental assistance before pursuing an eviction for back rent. You know, the courts can be a really important player here in keeping people housed. And so if there are opportunities to work with your courts, that would also be a really good avenue to, you know, talk about a lot of the things that folks have talked about here about, and the importance of housing stability for survivors. So that's just one other thought that I had. Yeah.
Carrie, are we going to answer? It's not a question, but the fair market rent. Can I just make a point about that?
Yes, please do.
Oh,
Yep.
okay. Sorry, this is not an emergency housing voucher webinar. We did that about 2 weeks ago. So definitely, if you're curious about the emergency housing vouchers that came out of the American Rescue Plan Act, tune into that webinar. It looks like there's another link that came out of the Alliance too. So really important about the emergency housing vouchers is that it's similar to the Housing Choice Voucher Program, but there are a number of requirements that are completely different. And so one of the things that is completely different is that for the emergency housing vouchers, the public housing authorities that have these vouchers, and again, keep in mind, not every housing authority has these vouchers. So again, look at the list that's on the HUD's EHV website, hud.gov/EHV. These housing authorities have the ability to waive the fair market rent limits. So they can go higher. They can go higher up to a certain amount, but they can go higher. And what that allows them to do is they can basically bypass all the bureaucratic review and approval with HUD Central, and they can just do it, which is a huge issue. And it addresses what this person is saying in terms of rents are growing astronomically in different communities.
Okay, well, on behalf of Freedom Network USA, thank you so much for joining us. And just remember that the slides and all the resources will be sent out. I think that's a wrap.
Thanks, Elisa and Carrie and Carlo.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.